What exercise takes the prize for being most frequently suggested to reduce stress, but so abstract that most people don't even understand how it impacts the brain? Welcome to the Sports Psychology of. Today we're talking about the sports psychology of meditation. So, what is meditation, and how does it boost your mental game? How can athletes start practicing meditation to reap its performance boosts? How can coaches incorporate meditation within their teams and ultimately build a more resilient, present-minded team culture? I'm excited to be joined by another podcaster, Dr. Pete Kadushin, to dive into meditation today. Pete Kadushin is the mental performance coach for the Chicago Blackhawks. In addition to his work in the NHL, he's had the privilege to work with a wide variety of performers, teams, and organizations with the goal of helping them develop the mental skills that will allow them to more consistently achieve their best. Pete's work focuses on two key areas of growth: helping people dial in their ability to learn and refine lessons quickly, and increasing their capacity to apply those lessons under pressure. And he believes that tools like self-reflection, breathwork, and meditation are invaluable as people walk this path. His core passion is to help people perform at their highest level so that they can live a more fulfilled, meaningful life. His podcast is called The Mental Training Lab, and I couldn't recommend it enough. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy. First question for you, Pete. Where does your love or appreciation for the mental side of sports come from? Do you have an example or a story of yours?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if I go back origin story style to my beginnings in the field, I was a wrestler in high school, and it was one of the first times that I really remember caring deeply about the outcome. I played a bunch of sports growing up, and they were always fun, and I always wanted to do well, but like I had a real fusion between my identity and the craft of wrestling, and so as I did on the mat is kind of how I felt. And so it was quite a roller coaster. And what I started to notice as I got further into the discipline was that there were days where I was lights out. Like I could beat the guys in the room that were quote unquote better than I was. And there were days where I would wildly underperform, and that basically my body was more or less the same. It was banged up because halfway through a wrestling season, everybody's hurt. Uh, and so you mix that with a little bit of the context that I grew up in. So my dad is a neuropsychologist, and there was a lot of language of psychology in the house. And so I was already predisposed to think about the mind. And I realized that there was probably something going on in between my ears that was influencing the way that I engaged my craft. And so, being the intrepid 15-year-old or 16-year-old, I went to Barnes and Noble, no affiliation, by the way, right? But I went to a unnamed, well, I guess it's named now. I went to a bookstore and I bought a sports psychology book. And I can't remember the title. I don't have it on my shelf anymore. But I read a little bit, and then I worked on my game a little bit, and I recognized that there were a bunch of levers that I could push, and then really I could push over and over again to train to get better at, that would allow me to do what I loved at a higher level more consistently. And so I'd like to think of it as not selfish, but it really started as, I was patient zero, and I continue to be now because I love to operate at a higher level. I love to be able to do the things that I enjoy and continue to grow and improve. That's got a lot of intrinsic motivation to it. And so I started to explore from there. And when I found out this was like a thing you could do for a career, I really tried to shape my college experience, and then very specifically my master's and Ph.D. experience, so that I could uh, graduate and then do the stuff I loved.
I think a lot of us in the sports psychology field can relate to us being patient zero and seeing how much it can benefit our game and facilitate our joy for the sport that we might have been losing, and realize everybody needs to learn this stuff. I would love to teach this stuff to others. And to your other point, I think consistency is something that everyone is striving to have at a high level. And it can be so frustrating, like you said, when some days you're lights out and then some days you're across the board unhappy with your performance and you can't understand the missing link to that consistency. And I think what we're talking about today, meditation, is a really important piece to consistency that a lot of people don't understand how it connects to sport performance and consistency. So I'm excited to get into it today about meditation, something that I started doing a lot more often once I understood the science behind it. So hopefully we can push some listeners to try it again if they haven't liked it in the past with a new method, or try it for the first time with a new lens, a new perspective around it. So without further ado, let's define meditation just a little bit. So when we talk about meditation in this episode, what are we exactly talking about here?
Yeah, it's an easily misunderstood uh idea or concept, and so meditation, as the way I define it, is really a collection of exercises that train mindfulness. And so meditation can look a lot of different ways, and there's a bunch of traditional ways to do it, but there's also a lot of active and non-traditional ways. And we'll get into that, I think, a little bit further on. But the bottom line is it's a collection of exercises. Just like you could think of if you're going into the weight room and you're doing pull specific stuff, well, you could do pull-ups, you could do rows, you could do a deadlift or a curl, right? There's a whole different suite of things you can do to challenge that type of activity, and you're going to get stronger for it. And so it's likewise, we can use a bunch of different types of meditation to address specific issues around where you're practicing mindfulness and when it's going to be most helpful. And so to get a little bit further in, then what is mindfulness? And mindfulness is a type of attention. And the type of attention is a present moment attention. So you're bringing your conscious awareness to what's happening here and now. And then there's a second piece that's really important, which is there's a non-judgmental or compassionate attitude that you take, a stance that you take to everything that comes up when you're here and now. And the reason that those two are important, right, is because anybody who's practiced meditation out there has recognized that when you get to the present moment, there's often two different categories that things land in. You either really like them and you want to hold on to them, right? Or there's stuff that you don't really like and you want to get rid of it. And so the example is, if you're feeling nice and relaxed and you're going like, ooh, this is a really good meditation session, like, all right, how can I keep this around? Or the opposite, right? You're sitting and you're breathing and you're following your breath and you go, oh man, there's a little wiggle in my back and that kind of hurts, or my knee starts to, and you're like, ooh, what do I do to get rid of it? And that's really a function of judgment. Whether it's good or bad, I'm now judging. And so the idea here is we actually take one step back or go one layer up above the judgment, and whatever arrives is here. So I bring my attention to the present moment, and then whatever shows up, I can allow to be here without having to say it's good or bad. I want more of it or I want less of it. And so when you pair those two things together, there's a bunch of really cool stuff that happens. And so this starts to get a little bit into why meditation. And I think from a big picture perspective, what we're interested in here is that when we think about why meditation, there's really two jobs that performers have, right? We have to get better as fast as we can. And then we need to be able to integrate those lessons that we've learned into performance, right? We have to be able to do the stuff we've learned in practice under pressure. And for either of those two jobs that we have, being present and allowing our present moment reality to emerge, right? That's a key to getting better, and it's the key to performing our best. And so if it'd be helpful, I can unpack that a little bit further in terms of the motivation and why that's useful, or you can steer us wherever else you want.
Yeah, that present-minded focus is something I preach to everybody I work with, and here's why. There might be a time and place for an athlete to be thinking about the past, something that has already happened, or to be thinking about the future, something that they plan to do or want to do, or something that hasn't happened yet. But most of the time, it is not helpful to be thinking in the past or future if you're trying to have your best shift of the game or trying to have your best performance. If you're trying to have your best performance, you want to be in the present moment most of the time. Because what ends up happening usually is when athletes are stuck thinking in the past too often, they experience frustration or regret or guilt. And when they're stuck thinking about the future, stuff that hasn't happened yet, or stuff that they're worried about happening or not happening, that facilitates a sense of anxiety and worry. And this is going to make you a bit more shaky. You're going to start overthinking all the stuff that people listening to this podcast are probably trying to manage. So that's why being able to train this skill of mindfulness-based meditation can end up resulting in more present-minded thinking during these games when you have so much pressure and when it's really easy not to be focused on the present moment. So that's kind of where a lot of my focus comes from, meditation, in how I see it translate to performance? Is there
Yeah,
maybe any piece that I'm missing there or anything to add?
well, I just wanted to, reiterate what you said is that time traveling is actually a very powerful tool, right? As humans, we have that superpower to be able to go to the past or go to the future. Right? But I try and explain to people, and this is actually really timely because I'm getting a new puppy this afternoon,
Oh,
but that our mind is like a puppy, and right, so left to its own devices, it's going to do basically whatever it wants to do. And what that means is, like you pointed to, you're sitting on the bench in between shifts. And if you had a great shift, you might be stuck in the past thinking about, oh man, that was awesome. And like I dangled that guy, right? I just scored. I set another person up. I shut that play down. Uh, but that can also then springboard us forward and go like, well, what do I start to really grasp. What do I need to do to keep this going? I'm worried that it's going to disappear. So now I have a little bit of this grasping and then this worry that it's not going to keep going. And likewise, if I had a bad shift, now I'm dragged into the past and I'm struggling back there and I'm thinking about it, but it's consuming a lot of my energy, which means that I can't then get back out on the ice and have my present moment attention and be grounded in my body when it's time to perform my best. And so I often talk with athletes about making sure that you schedule your time travel, right? So when it's time to review practice or review a game, right, to do it with some boundaries. I'm going to sit down and for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to follow some structure to journal or evaluate. I'll do my reflection. And then when I close that out, if I'm laying down in bed later that night and my mind starts to wander, ooh, that shift or that, and this was good or that was bad, you've already done the work, right? You can let it go. And likewise, the goal setting, that future oriented, the planning, right? If all we're doing is planning constantly, then we're not present and we can't take a step forward from where we actually are. And what ends up happening when we time travel too much is that we stop being connected to our present moment reality. And there's a lot of danger there because if you think about it, this is really the only place that we can move forward, right? The only place I can take a step forward from is where my 2 feet are in this exact minute. But what we end up doing is going to what I like to call fantasy land, which is I wish it were this way, or things would be easier, or I'd get more playing time if, or, and you can't make progress from there. But if our mind is stuck in that space, we keep convincing ourselves that if only things were a little bit different, then we'd be able to get closer to the things that we really want, whether it's consistency or it's moving up a level or it's more playing time. And so I really appreciate you brought up this idea that presence isn't the only thing you want always. There's a good time to be in the past. There's a good time to be in the future. But when it's time to be your best, we need to be in our bodies and we need to be present to the experience we're having.
I think it's facilitating great performance when an athlete can think back to a prior shift and gain confidence from it or learn from the shift rather than have this frustration or guilt. And likewise, looking to the future when they can plan, when they can change their plan according to what's going on in the game in the present to change what might happen in the future. This is where it facilitates performance. But like you said, most of the time we want to be in the present moment. I think we've been talking about how meditation can help you be more present-minded focused, which is awesome. But there's a second part of meditation that I find very important is this awareness training. So part of meditation, this practice that we're going to dive into a bit more here is maybe sitting and focusing on one of your senses or going for a walk and noticing all the sounds that you hear. Once you eventually become distracted, because that is a guarantee as you practice meditation, you will become distracted. And that's when you non-judgmentally come back to what you're focusing on. You're improving this skill of awareness of noticing, oh, hey, I was distracted. Now, maybe you were distracted thinking about what to make for dinner or all the work or schoolwork you have to do that night. Maybe that lasted 30 seconds. And then you non-judgmentally come back to what you're focusing on. And then maybe after a couple of weeks of meditating consistently, this 30 seconds changes to 10 seconds. And you catch yourself much more quickly about being unfocused and distracted from what you should be thinking about. Now, let's take this into a game setting where you have all this pressure. You're obviously going to be overthinking at some points where you're distracted and not focused on performance facilitating cues. By practicing meditation consistently for a good amount of time, you can decrease the amount of time that it takes for you to notice that you are thinking ineffectively, that your mental game is not helping you play your best. So you're going to spend less time thinking about performance damaging cues because your awareness is training you to catch when you don't have this effective focus. So it goes hand in hand, but this meditation will improve your awareness of when you're thinking ineffectively so that you can reel yourself in to the present moment to effective cues to think about to facilitate performance.
Well, and I think you're spot on here, and it's really well. Let's lay out the steps, the broad steps, and then I think it'll land really clearly. Is the first thing that meditation asks of us, or mindfulness asks of us, is to be in the present moment. And you can't get to the present moment if you don't notice that you're not here, right?
Yeah.
You can't consciously and volitionally make that happen. And so the recognizing is a really important first step, right? And most meditation exercises include a really like this constant coming back, this returning, right? Because our minds, I talk about our minds as like the noisy neighbors upstairs, right? And so all of the thoughts and all of the emotions that are then associated with those thoughts, and even the bodily sensations that are attached to some of those thoughts, right? All of that can be stuff that's happening upstairs, right? But there's a way that we can then bring our attention and our awareness to the task at hand that doesn't need to play whack-a-mole with them. Because you'll notice that at no point have we talked about getting rid of anything. Remember, the whole idea with that non-judgmental attitude is that whatever is here is okay. And I'd like to put, actually, it's an important caveat here, right? If you are in physical danger, right, then allowing the bodily sensations and the thoughts and the feelings to arise, right, like take action, right, remove yourself from a dangerous situation, right? But that if we're thinking about most mindfulness settings, right, something uncomfortable or unpleasant is allowed to be here just as much as anything that's pleasant, right? And so it starts with that recognizing. And so we get an anchor of attention. And so in traditional mindfulness practice, it's going to be our breath, because you can't leave home without it. And it's kind of boring, right? And so actually the bar is set pretty high when you think about traditional meditation, because like the breath is, it's beautiful and it's amazing. And it's one of the greatest tools we have when it comes to performance, but it's not like super sexy when you're sitting on a chair and you're just paying attention to your breath. And so we're really setting the conditions for your mind to run wild. And that's what minds do. It's a thought generating machine. It's going to create problems and solve problems and spit out ideas, and your imagination is going to be everywhere. And so we create the conditions for you to have an anchor. I want my attention to be here, right? And then we set the conditions for your attention to wander. And then every time you notice that it wanders, you bring it back. And you did a great job of then explaining how that spills over into not only everyday life, but performance, where instead of stewing for your entire time in between a shift, right? Or, in between golf shots, or you spend an entire time in between this race and next race worrying about and chewing up, and right, you catch yourself and go, oh, okay, those are thoughts. And this speaks to the diffusion or the unhooking aspect, right? Mindfulness is really a practice of unhooking from. And if we think about that grasping to the stuff that we like, or the trying to avoid the stuff we don't, what we're doing is trying to unhook from being dragged one way or the other, and instead just allowing whatever comes up to come up. And so now I'm sitting on the bench and I had a tough shift, and all sorts of thoughts are coming up. There's sentences that are running through my head, and some of them might be productive or some of them might be unproductive. But before I go anywhere with that, right, is I can use the mindfulness, if I've trained this outside of performance, to unhook from whatever the sentence is, come back to the present moment, right? It might be my butt on the bench. A lot of athletes use the water bottle as a reminder. So they're either taking a sip of water or they're splashing the water on their face, right? There's a physical sensation to that. There is a direct experience. And now I'm in the direct experience. And then the next step from there, if I'm thinking about performance related, right, is then to reconnect with the cue that I want to be paying attention to, right? So it might be some productive ideas that I have, or some images that I want to create, or it might just be watching the guy out there on the ice that's doing your job right now, so that you can re-engage the rhythm of the game, right? But that's really, it's the same arc that you would have sitting on a cushion or sitting in a chair, right? But we're now just allowing it to be applied to a specific task as opposed to breathing. And so great job kind of sketching out how it goes from one step to the other.
Let's talk a bit more about different ways meditation might look like, and we will get to more specific how listeners can implement meditation into their practice. But for now, just kind of a general what meditation might look like in different people. But before we get into that a bit more, I have a question. True or false? We can only focus on one thought at a time. We can't be focusing on multiple things at once.
Yeah, yeah. I used to ask, and every once in a while I'll still roll this out. I'll ask, who here is a great multitasker? And you always have somebody raise their hand, or sometimes a group of somebody's. And there's an interesting thing in our culture that really rewards this idea of multitasking. I can do a bunch of stuff at once. And the truth is that we're really doing a bunch of things single task wise, right? But we're bouncing back and forth and back and forth. And what it means is that we're just less effective at whatever we're actually trying to accomplish. And so, true, wait, I can't remember which way you phrased it. Yes, true, we can only pay attention to one thing at a time. And the psychological flexibility that you cultivate with meditation means that, right, if a basketball is turned over, right, I can shift very quickly from offense to defense. So it's not that I'm getting really rigid about paying attention to one thing and my attention is only here, right? But what it is doing is it's giving you control, more control over that spotlight of attention so that you can shift it on purpose and it's not getting hijacked by a bunch of stuff that you don't want it to be hijacked by.
I think it's an essential prerequisite to understand to meditation that you cannot multitask. You cannot focus on multiple things at once. Instead, you can focus on one thing, an anchor, and then you cannot be focused on something else. So, what this means, why this is important, is if you're focused on the sounds of the stadium, what your stick feels like, you're not giving your brain any room to think about something that's going to hurt your mental performance. You're not really giving your brain room to think about the past and get frustrated or to be as anxious and worried about the future because you're occupying the mind in the present moment. So we're going to use this as a jumping point of what can we anchor to in the meditation practice that is going to not leave room for any other thoughts. And a lot of times this ends up being the senses, because when you're focused on a sense, which is almost always with you, especially some senses, when you're locked onto one of these senses, you're not focusing on anything else. What is true is you might be bouncing back and forth pretty quickly between a sense and then the future, back to the sense that you want to anchor to, and then maybe you're back to the past. However, once you are keyed in to a sense or whatever you're meditating on, you're effectively having a strong mental game. So I don't want people to think that a lot of people who meditate are locked on to a sense for minutes at a time, even 10 minutes at a time. It's not as pretty like that. It's a couple seconds here and there, you're locked onto your sense, and then you might lose focus. But then again, you non-judgmentally just come right back to that anchor. So let's talk about how this looks specifically with some of the different senses. And let's start with the sense of feel or touch. This is the common one that a lot of people start off learning about, whereas you focus on what it feels like to be breathing in, the sensation of air coming in through your nostrils, going down your throat into your lungs and out your mouth. That's something that you can always focus on, that you can feel. But like you said, that can be pretty fleeting because it's not as abstract, or it's a bit more abstract than other things you can feel, like all the tactile sensations on your stick, your bat, the basketball, or even your feet on the court. Pete, what do you have to add about going over how somebody can meditate on something that they're feeling?
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting split we can make here, right? So there's internal and then external experiences we can have around feel. And so I split those out because uh, there's a lot of stuff that happens inside of us body wise. And I think that those bodily sensations, whether it's the feel of your breath moving down your throat into your belly or the rise and fall of your belly, uh, that it's useful to take time and build that connection relationship to your body. And so those become really productive anchors for attention, right? But when it comes time to go perform, right, I don't really want to be anchored inside my body, right? Because in order to execute at a high level, I need to be reading the cues that are happening in the environment and then responding. And I need to be able to respond with some freedom, right, of choice so that I can pick the right thing at the right time and then execute. And so being able then to schedule or create part of your sort of exercise regimen around mindfulness so that you're then getting used to the tactile sensations, right? So the things that are happening outside of my body that I'm related to. And so you notice a lot of mindfulness scripts will start with, notice your butt on the chair, right? So this is me in relationship to my external environment, right? And then they might shift if my anchor is going to be my breath to what the internal sensations. And I think the good scripts come back to what's happening in the environment after that, including sort of how my feet are contacting the floor or my elbows on the chair arms and all of those sorts of things. But I think one of the big things that I always try and arrive with, if we go back to the strength and conditioning example, is not all poles are created the same. And so if we think about an athlete and what they need to strengthen, right, we're picking specific exercises from that suite of different pulling exercises. We're picking those with purpose. And likewise, if we think about working with an athlete, right, there's going to be different exercises, whether it's internal focus or external focus or which sense we pick, that's really going to be geared towards where are we trying to grow the strength or where are we trying to create an opportunity for improvement. And that becomes really individualized.
That's really cool. I didn't think about it that way of how can I practice this meditation to facilitate my dynamics mid-game and how that changes. So basically trying to replicate it in a way off your performance domain, off your court or rink, and try and translate the results even more effectively. One question I have is, would it be effective or problematic in any way if someone is meditating on both the internal and external physical cues that they feel? Is it more effective to just go internal and then pick a different time to just go external? Or is it okay if I'm bouncing back and forth between how it feels to sit in this chair as well as how it feels to be inhaling and exhaling? Or should I try and stick to one of those at once?
So I'm going to bring it back to that strength and conditioning example. And you could use sports specific skills too, but strength and conditioning, I think, is generalizable. And so you can have really isolated types of movements, right? So a deadlift is all glute with a little bit of hammy, right? And so it's not particularly complex. There's a hinge at the hips. Right now, if you introduce a squat, you can put the squat weight on the back or the front, or you can hold the kettlebell like a goblet, and it's all going to be just a little bit different. But now you've introduced a lot of complexity, right? The knees bending, the quads are involved, and so there are different levels of meditation as well. And so if we think about a beginner who's really trying to get the most benefit and really do it well, and I use air quotes when I say do it well, and I think we need to touch back on that idea of doing it right versus wrong in a second, right? But if we want to start at the easiest level, quote unquote, because it's not easy, but it's simple, that you pick one and you create really strict boundaries, right? So if it's my breath, I'm staying with my breath. If it's the feeling of my feet on the floor and my butt in the chair, then I stick with that, right? Because that's going to be a really clear and concrete directive for that puppy that's in between my ears to stick with one thing. And then if we want to go up a level, make it a little more complex, we could say, okay, well, let's stay with any sort of bodily sensation. So I could go with the air brushing against my body as I sit. I could go with feeling underneath my nose of the air coming in or out. It could be a grumble in my stomach. Right? It could be and so now we've opened the aperture a little bit and allowed for a wider view. And then there's also choiceless awareness training, which is you sit down and you create a physical anchor, right? So you're on your seat, but you just kind of let your mind do what it does and you notice it without an actual physical, you don't have an anchor, right? So you haven't chosen my breath or physical sensations or sounds. You just stay centered as all of the sensations and present moment consciousness experience swirls around you. And the thing is, that's really hard because we end up riding the roller coaster of all of that stuff. This is like expert level mental jujitsu here, right? And so you can kind of scaffold at level 1, level 2, and then you go up to level like 42 when you think about choiceless awareness. But the beautiful thing is you can add more weight to the bar, right? And you can also then change the exercise to challenge it in a different way. But we don't want to be fleeting with what we've chosen. So you don't want to be halfway through your 5 minutes and go, you know what? It actually feels a little bit better to be in my butt instead of with my breath. And so I'm going to shift because there's a lot that we get from being grounded with the anchor and staying committed to that anchor throughout the however long I've decided, whether it's 2 minutes or an hour.
And that makes sense in a how does this connect to my performance way, because I'm not just going to be shifting from like, you know what, I'm just going to start ignoring what coach told me to focus on. I'm going to do my own thing. It's like, no, no, no. You got to have this consistent focus throughout your game. So try and replicate that in meditation, just like you would try and replicate game-like situations in practice.
Yeah, and like you sit down on a chair and you do this, and some days it's easy and some days it's hard. And again, air quotes easy, because we're still going to get distracted, right?
Yep.
Easy doesn't mean I'm locked in for 30 minutes and I don't get distracted once. Uh, but there are times where you sit down and it feels like the only thing you can't pay attention to is whatever your anchor is. And the thing that we want to be careful is we don't want to then just let our mind run wild, because we're reinforcing that behavior. And so that what we notice is in pressure packed performance situations, we're now training that when things get tough, we go someplace else, right? We get distracted. We end up dissociating from the present moment. Right. And that's the opposite of what we want to train. And so being able to stay consistent, especially when it's tough, no matter the duration of the meditation exercise, is really useful, because it's teaching us to stay with both the good and the bad, again, air quotes, because we're going to judge, we're going to notice, ooh, I really like that, I don't like this. And then even using that as I can notice that. I can notice that that thought or that feeling is arising, the leaning toward something that feels good, or the kind of subtle recoiling against a thought or a feeling or a bodily sensation that comes up. And I can start to not be as reactive to those internal experiences. And similarly, I can train myself to be less reactive to the external experiences.
Earlier, you said something that I loved, where the breath is not sexy to focus on. Everybody who isn't too familiar with meditation thinks about it as focusing on the breath. But I agree in a sense that I don't have my most effective meditations when I focus on the breath. It's usually something else. So let's go to some different senses and how it might look for someone to meditate on something that isn't the breath, even though that is a great sensation to focus on, to anchor to, especially during games, because like you said, you do not leave your house without the breath. But there are still other ways to train the skill of meditation and being mindful, especially when the pressure is on. So let's talk about sight, how to meditate on your visual field. I think this is a really cool one, because most of our sensory receptors are in our eyes. So there's a lot of information that we're constantly processing through our visual field, which makes it a very effective anchor to focus on. And something really cool about meditating on your visual field is you can do this with eyes open and eyes closed. Obviously, with eyes open, there is a lot of information that you're looking at. And one way that I learned how to meditate with my eyes open is basically having something to focus on, a specific little object, but also widening your gaze, trying to basically absorb everything you can see in your peripheral vision as well as what you're focused on. This is such a cognitive demanding task that it's so clear that I'm focused on the present when I'm doing this. And then how this might look like when your eyes are closed is it's not just pitch dark a lot of the time when you close your eyes. There are little flashes that you're seeing, maybe visualizations that you're imagining with your eyes closed that you can also focus on, that has this dynamic visual field to it, that again, it can be an anchor for you to focus on, that you find yourself anchored to the present moment with your eyes closed, just focusing on the visual field. What do you have to add, or is there anything important for us to talk about when meditating on the visual field?
Well, I think that we're starting to get closer to more sport specific examples, right? This idea that most of us aren't going to perform with our eyes closed. Uh, I can't think of a domain that I've worked with where having your eyes closed while you're in the middle of performance is really a great idea. And so we're starting to mirror the context a little bit more closely. And like you pointed to, there's a wealth of information that comes through. It's so much that we can't really even process all of it. And so there's an opportunity to use, again, a specific anchor. And like you said, it can either be a broad anchor or a narrow anchor. I can just take in everything in my visual field, or I can pick a specific thing. And so the traditional uh, training that one might do here would be to light a candle in a dark room and then sit in front of the candle and watch the candle. Right. But if you want to step away from the traditional, you can pick anything. right? And so you could lay on your back in a field and stare at the clouds. And this actually becomes a really interesting analogy for what it's like for our mind, right? If the sky is our mind and then clouds are thoughts, what we notice as we're paying attention to the clouds is that clouds come and go on their own. And this becomes a really interesting thing because a byproduct of bringing our attention to the present moment with a non-judgmental or compassionate attitude is that we start to shift our relationship to our mind, right? And so again, that unhooking or that diffusing from our thoughts, I'm no longer what my thought is, right? I have a little bit of space between the thought that just happened or the feeling that came up or the bodily sensation and who I am. And so clouds can be a really great one because the way I describe is when you're hooked by a cloud, you might lay on your back and you watch the cloud start to drift, and then you might follow it with your eyes instead of holding your eyes just in a wide aperture over the sky. And then, if you were really hooked by the cloud, you might get up and start walking after it or hop on your bike or get in your car. Right. But there's another choice, which is if I just stay laying down and I stay looking up, eventually that cloud's going to leave on its own. And this is true about even the most intense experiences we have, whether they're positive or negative, is that they're impermanent. And so I might notice some pain in my lower back, right? But if I really pay attention and I don't just judge it and go, ew, oh, that hurts, right? That there's actually really a lot going on in my direct experience. And so there's a rhythm to the pain, right? There's a pulsing and a flowing, and then sometimes it's hot and sometimes it's not. And then sometimes it actually doesn't hurt. But if I'm not paying attention, I just go, oh, my lower back hurts and I'm stuck. And so I think that would be a really interesting way to engage the visual side of, but then we can get even closer to sport specific stuff. So now you're at practice, but it's not your turn. You're in between drills. Okay, so pick a point of attention, right? So the golf ball, the basketball, the puck, your teammate running around the track, right? And then just notice as your mind starts to wander, your eyes start to wander, and then bring your eyes back. And again, do it non-judgmentally with a compassionate attitude for whatever shows up that gets in the way.
And doing this with a mindset of how can I notice every detail possible? That's what anchors you to that present moment, where it's going to take more of your focus to stay with that anchor. And again, it's more effective training for the mind in that way. And I like that you said in between like drills at practice, and this could be even in games in between shifts. This is such a good opportunity for the brain to become an enemy, where you have an opportunity to get stuck in the past, to worry about the future. And that's why this is such a great opportunity to practice this meditation, to anchor yourself to the present when it's easy for the mind to wander into performance damaging cues.
Yeah, and I think that there's some value to pointing out that sometimes mind wandering is actually not a problem. So you think about a 4-hour golf round or an ultra marathon, which could take 30 hours. That there's no way that you're going to be 100% present the whole time. And so I really like to schedule my on times and work with my athletes to schedule their on times. And so as long as in between shots, your mind isn't wandering someplace unproductive.
Yeah.
And again, the practice of meditation allows you to recognize when you've wandered into the thorny, prickle bushes of unproductive thought. But as long as your mind isn't wandering in that direction, it is actually really good to allow your gaze to get wide, to allow your mind to go where it wants, because it takes a lot of energy. You just pointed to it's cognitively demanding to be really dialed in.
Yeah.
And so, and this actually holds true. We used to think that flow was about being really intensely focused, right? But flow has a very permissive, very relaxed quality to it, right? There isn't a forcing that happens in flow. And so the idea that you could actually drift a little bit back from your performance in the middle of a game or a round of golf or something, and that when it's time to be on time, when it's time to be here and now, I can feel that comfort of just being pulled forward into the present moment. I'm where my feet are or where my skates are, and that I'm comfortable with that rhythm of expansion and contraction, the back and forth. Because I think a lot of times when we start training athletes on mindfulness, it's like, okay, now I'm dialed, right? This is it. I'm holding the spotlight and I'm shining the spotlight and it's staying here. And that's actually unproductive if we do it too long.
Maybe that's relieving for a lot of people to hear that they don't have to be dialed at all times. In fact, it might be more facilitating to their performance to not be dialed in all the time, because that means you're dialed in an inefficient way, where you don't need to be dialed and focused so intently. Intermissions in hockey is a great example. Halftime in basketball is you don't necessarily want to be so intently focused on something during those 15 minutes because you might be taking away energy that your brain needs to use in the upcoming period or half.
That's right. And it's different for everybody. Right. But I mean, I'll use an example. I was on the golf course and I was shooting my best round to date. And we get to the ninth hole and I turn to my dad, I'm looking at the scorecard and he goes, "Don't look at the scorecard. You don't want to know." And it's like, it's no big deal, man. I'm just gonna hit it in the fairway and then hit it on the green. And it kind of really pushed against that idea that like once you know you're in flow and you start thinking about it, you're out. But I think really what's going on is when you start worrying about keeping flow, again, that attachment to the good stuff or the worry that the bad stuff's going to show up, that's the thing that gets in the way. Right? Because it's not that there aren't negative thoughts or negative experiences that don't show up during flow. It's not that you're going to have every perfect play. It's that the perfect or the quote unquote bad plays, right? The unproductive things or the bad swings, that those aren't that big a deal, right? You hit it in the woods, you go, okay, I'm gonna go find it and then I'll hit it out. As opposed to that very rigid, very crispy sense of I'm here now. And if I go anywhere else, everything's ruined. And so mindfulness helps train that ability to be into our body and then connected to the external environment in a way that's much softer, right? And softness not being a detriment here, but really actually the superpower, that ability to work with what's here as opposed to trying to force something else to show up.
There's a couple other senses that I still want to get to, but I just want to say that I think smell and taste are not as relevant in meditation practice for athletes. I think it still is an effective way to meditate, but it's easier to replicate the meditation in games when the pressure is on, when it's something about feel, something about sight, and then sounds, which I want to get to here. But is it worth getting into the taste and smell sensations? Do you practice that with your athletes that you work with, or do you push them to different senses, or do you just say, hey, whatever works for you?
Well, so I think it's useful to honor that everybody's kind of got their go-to channel, right? And so for me personally, sound and particularly music has it's just a faster route. It's like the super highway into the present moment. And so I find that really helpful. And it actually becomes one of my flow triggers. And so if I'm thinking about trying to get myself into that state where I can perform my best under pressure, music and rhythm really does that for me. Right. But it's different for everybody. Some people are really tactile and kinesthetic, and it's the feel of the experience. So the puck hits your stick and you've got that feeling of the present moment, the direct experience. I think that when we're training, that taste can be really useful because something that isn't sport related, but I think everybody does every day, more or less, is eat. And mindful eating is a wonderful way to anchor yourself in the present moment. And so I think we won't go into the details, but the idea being, again, you're anchoring yourself to the taste of the experience, noticing the desire to speed up because most of us eat really quickly, right? And being with it can actually be a really joyful experience. You learn that, oh man, that's what a strawberry tastes like. That's unbelievable. I've been eating them for years and I haven't even paid attention. But when it comes to the sport specific, I think there's plenty of carryover there, right? But it's not as relatable because whatever your mouth guard tastes like, I don't think that's a great place to be putting your attention when it's time to go over the boards.
Let's talk about sound a bit more in depth here, and then we'll get to some examples of pro athletes using meditation, and then we can get to the action items. So I love what you're saying about music, that music is such a fun anchor for me to focus on, to meditate on, because it can really grab me and it's quick, like you said. One way I like to teach this with my clients is try and focus on every sound you can hear in a certain song. And it's really fun when you let them pick the song that they want to meditate on, because it's more, again, this is such a clear example of how meditation is a lot more fun for me when I'm meditating on a song like this, as opposed to focusing on my breath. So this is a great example of how someone can actually get engaged and get that buy-in with meditation more than they thought was possible beforehand, because it's not just focusing on the breath. So this is also a great way to implement or refine your pregame routine. So a lot of people already listen to music before their games. Why not crank up the effectiveness of your pregame routine by having some time to carve out to meditate on the song that you're listening to train this, basically remind your brain of how to do this refocusing when it's going to matter very soon here when your game begins. Where else do you go though with this meditation on sound practice?
Yeah, I think it's a useful moment to pause and point out that many athletes have gotten to the level they've gotten to because they already kind of know how to do this. And like you pointed to, this is a part of a lot of athletes' pre-performance routines. And so without knowing it, that idea that we're kind of got the headphones on, or there's music in the locker room, or there's music on the bus, that this is actually something that's pulling us into the present moment. And now we're just teaching you to do it intentionally, whether it's part of your pre-performance routine, or you're doing it away from the sport itself. And just like clouds, I think it's useful to recognize that even right now, if the listeners are hearing us speak, that sound is impermanent. You have no choice but to hear it when it shows up, right? Because you're listening to us, right? But my voice doesn't stick around. You can think about what I just said, but that's not the same right now. That's being stuck in the past. Or you might try and anticipate what I'm going to say next. But each of the actual direct experiences of the words hitting your eardrums and then your brain translating them, right? That's a impermanent and temporary experience. And if you're in the flow of that present moment experience, you're really just with the sounds as they're unfolding. And what's really neat is that we can actually go one layer back because, right, there's two steps that I just pointed to, right? The sounds hitting your eardrums and then the thinking about what those sounds mean, right? And it's really tough, right? If it's words in your language that you speak, right, then you really, it's almost instantaneous. The words hit your eardrums and you're processing. And it's a fun game to play to see if you can actually step back and just hear the sounds for sounds. And this is, again, this is a higher level of challenge because, again, our brains take the symbols and they turn them into meaning instantly. And so then you can practice with nonverbal sounds, right? Whether it's music without lyrics or it's music in another language, or it's just listening to the sounds in your environment. Uh, I try when I sit to not have a lot of, every once in a while I'll put music on or a sound machine on, right? But a lot of times I just kind of allow whatever wants to arrive. So it's the beeping dump truck, or it's the birds chirping, or the dogs barking, and that those actually can become incorporated into the practice, right? Oh, I noticed that it's temporary. My attention moves that direction, and then I can bring it back to whatever my anchor is. And maybe the anchor is whatever sounds arise and whatever pass. It's really about the fidelity. How intensely can we arrive to that? And so you said, right, how much detail can you pick up? And it becomes a great way of drawing yourself further into the present moment. He's like, what color is the shirt? But no, really, let's focus on, right? You might just say blue, right? But what kind of blue? And can I notice, well, blue is an idea, right? What am I actually seeing? Just like, okay, well, how can I turn up my sound sensitivity a little bit further, right? And really get into, okay, well, even when there's silence, there's usually something happening, right? And so it becomes a really great way of drawing us into the present moment without having to feel like we got to force ourselves in there.
And why I think this is a more effective practice of meditation to facilitate sport performance is music is great. It's easier to focus on to train this in the beginning, but maybe the expert way of meditating is to be this, I'm just going to process whatever sounds I hear, the dump truck, the air conditioning, the clock, because this is very much something you can take in with your games. There's going to be times when, again, you're sitting on the bench, you're in the dugout, where you can notice yourself thinking ineffectively, and you can just go to absorbing every single sound that you can hear non-judgmentally, and then boom, you're locked into the present.
Yeah, man, sporting events are noisy. And so it can be the music in whatever breaks happen, or it can be the sounds of the sport, right? And every athlete right now can think of the sounds of their sport. And there's a little bit of, almost always, there's a little bit of comfort that comes with that, right? It feels a little bit like coming home. And so those things, again, when they're happening in the present moment, I'm not recreating them in some sort of imagery, right? That becomes a really great anchor to yank me out of whatever unproductive thoughts or feelings or wherever my attention is, and then get me almost like a little interrupt so that I can then unhook from that and then shift my attention in the middle of a performance back to what's productive.
So I want to talk about, before we get into these action items, two examples of hockey players using meditation to benefit their performance. And they're very different examples, which is fun. So Roman Yossi discussed in an article around the pandemic, and this is a hockey player who won best defenseman in the league. He's captain of his team in Nashville. And he talked about how he meditated for 30 minutes in the morning and at night to basically facilitate a sense of calm, manage stress levels, and again prep the mind to think a certain way for his games. And he said he even upped this to an hour in the morning and at night around the pandemic, because you can imagine all of the ways athletes were being stressed out because of all the how the life changes that everybody had to just tolerate. And a different example of athletes using this meditation is Devin Levi, is a goaltender for the Buffalo Sabres who recently started his NHL career after having a lot of expectations, and he's been excellent in his start. And he's only played a handful of games, but he has been noticed to do something a bit different than other goalies during these TV timeouts. So a lot of goalies might stay in their crease, drink water, and just kind of hang out. Other goalies might go to their bench, be with their team, talk to their goalie partner. But Devin Levi has been noticed to kind of come out to his crease to the middle of the ice and just sit and meditate. And when asked about this, he simply replied, well, there's nothing else that I can be doing. There's not many options of what I can be doing right now. So I might as well just take in everything that's going on around me now. Who knows what he's meditating on? It could be the sounds. It could be his visual field. It could be parts of the process that he wants to keep focusing on. But like we're going to discuss here, there's a lot of freedom to practicing meditation and what works best for you. So something that I preach about training any mental skill is I like to give you the blueprint, but you're going to fill in the details of when you do it, how you do it, and the things that you focus on is going to be up to you and what you find most productive in helping your mental game. Before we get to the action items, do you have any examples you want to share of athletes using meditation?
Yeah, I think this is something that's becoming much more mainstream, and it kind of coming out from underneath or behind the curtain. And the original example, and again, it's not original because meditation's been around for like over 2,000 years. But the one that we can think of most readily often in the sport lexicon is Phil Jackson's Bulls and then his Lakers. Right? Because he was a mindfulness proponent himself, he saw the value of being able to single task on purpose when it was time to get out there and play, and then to let go of stuff that was unproductive when it was time to get back out there. And so, the Bulls were doing yoga and they were practicing mindfulness meditation, and it was back in the 90s, seemingly revolutionary. And so then, you've got examples of Michael Jordan talking about it, Kobe talking about how valuable it is. More contemporary, you've got LeBron as the face of the app Calm. And then, Novak Djokovic has talked about meditating as well. And even down in the college ranks, the Michigan quarterback, JJ McCarthy, was, photographed sitting under the goalpost before games doing his meditation. And so it's out there. If you want more non-sport examples, I'm a big fan of the Tim Ferriss show. And he at one point crunched the data on all of the guests who were all super high performers in their domains, crunched the data, and it was something like over 80% of them had some sort of mindfulness practice. Right. And so we start to really build this through line of people who are elite at their craft or interested in becoming elite at their craft, and understanding that this tool of, or this, again, the quality of attention known as mindfulness, being a facilitator for both performance and then also that growth that allows us to keep stepping up the levels. And so for me, it's something that's really exciting to see because, now I have athletes coming to me being like, hey, I read this thing about mindfulness, or, I saw this, or I downloaded this app, and like, tell me a little bit about it, as opposed to the way it used to be, which would be like, hey, we're going to do a bit of attention control practice. I wouldn't even call it meditation because people kind of recoil a little bit because it seemed woo-woo at the time. And really, there's nothing woo-woo about it.
All right, Pete, let's say we did it. We have an athlete listening right now and they are bought in, they want to start meditating, but they don't really know how to start. Do you have a go-to method for people new to meditation that you can recommend as a way to frame their practice as they begin meditating?
Yeah. So like you pointed to, the breath can be more challenging. But I also think that because it's neutral, right? It's not something that generally we're getting stuck grasping for, or we're kind of pushing away from. And because it comes with that impermanence, right? That each breath lasts a certain extent. It's an inhale, it's an exhale, right? That it's an important component to a well-rounded mindfulness diet. And so what I often do will work with an athlete to find something else that's really compelling, right? That's I call it everyday mindfulness or mundane mindfulness, something that they do regularly that they can bring their attention to, and then pair that with some sprinkled in opportunities to use the breath as an anchor. And so an example of something that's not super sort of activating, right? Could be, some part of your pre-performance warm-up. So athletes generally get really into and build some pretty firm routine around their warm-up. And so can you bring your full attention to the direct experience of, putting on your shin guards as a soccer player and lacing up your cleats? Can you bring your full attention to taping your stick? And again, like that happens all the time. Everybody kind of goes on autopilot as they're just doing it, right? Can I, for this little bounded time, and I think this is really important, no matter what you choose as an anchor, right? The first piece is you want an anchor, and it has to be a really concrete, clear one, right? But the second piece is we want to have a defined start and a defined end. Because although you can sit down and just have no idea, and like if you go to a meditation retreat, they don't tell you how long the sit is going to be, right? So you just kind of sit there and then you notice when you're like, is it time yet? And oh, that's a distraction. Yeah. Right. And so there's value there, but it's also a much higher bar to clear, right? We've added a lot of weight to the bar. And so you want to clear beginning and end. And then the third important guideline here is you want to start where you can feel successful. Yeah. And then add more weight to the bar. We don't put you under a squat rack with 500 pounds on it. Go like, well, you'll figure it out. Right. And although there isn't a risk of physical harm like that example, when we think about, hey, sitting down to do 30 minutes of meditation right out of the gate, right? You pointed to this right in the intro, is that a lot of people have unproductive or unsavory experiences with meditation up front. No, that didn't work. Or all I did was be distracted. Right. And so start where you can be successful. I usually start with 2 minutes. And people go, oh, 2 minutes is nothing. I'm ready to jump into it. But like you pointed to, your mind will wander. I used to do this in group workshops. We'd do 1 minute, and then I'd say, raise your hand as soon as you get distracted. And about 20 seconds in, almost everybody's hand is raised. And then you always have the one person who's like, I was here the whole time. Look, I know you think that was true, right? But that just means that you were distracted the entire time, right? Because nobody is dialed in for a whole minute at any given time. And so then maybe that's a fourth guideline or just a caveat, which is, and we've been building to this entire time, is that we can get caught up in paying attention consecutively for, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds is the idea of doing it right. And then we can get really frustrated when we feel like we're not doing it right. So I can get up off the cushion after 20 minutes and go, man, I spent all 20 minutes distracted. And I can get discouraged, or I can think that I'm screwing up and that, well, you know what, there's less motivation tomorrow to do it. It's important to recognize that even when I get up off the cushion after 20 minutes, and if it feels like I was lost, there is plenty of moments where I go, oh, my mind is wandering. Ah, there's my breath. And then it might be a split second before I'm distracted again. Ah, I come back. And so the way I describe it to athletes is that each one of those is a rep. Yep. And so we've now designed a win-win scenario. So if I pay attention for 2 minutes consecutively, which is wildly unlikely, even though I've been meditating for more or less a decade, right? Like those 2 minutes, well, great. Congratulations. I'm feeling really calm and really settled in this moment, and my mind isn't quite as active as it usually is. But if I spend that 2 minutes and I'm distracted 60 times, but I recognize every single time that it happens and I come back, again, do the math. That means 2 seconds a pop before I'm distracted again, right? That's actually success too, because I've just gotten 60 reps of noticing and then returning. And that is really the two things, right? Is I notice that I'm gone, I return. And as I'm doing it with a non-judgmental and compassionate attitude. I'm not a jerk for getting distracted. The thoughts or the feelings or the dog barking outside, that's not a bad person or a bad thing. And so, one of the mantras I bring to athletes when we are working on mindfulness practice is no big deal. right? The dog barking, no big deal, right? The fact that you missed an open net, no big deal. And you're going to have people out there that really recoil. You can see the physical tension in them when you say this because it feels like a big deal. Or even the negative self-talk, the anxiety, that roiling in your stomach pre-performance, right? We can start to learn that unsavory or unpleasant experiences, they feel like a big deal because we connect thoughts and meaning to them. And the better we get at diffusing from them, right? Creating that space and noticing for them for what they are, right? The easier it is then to do my job while the noisy neighbors upstairs are banging around and doing all of that. And we all have examples of this where, there's some construction happening outside, right? And all of a sudden it kind of just fades into the background. It might be annoying for a little bit, but then it kind of just fades, right? Or the people upstairs are having a party and like, man, that's unbelievable. That's so, and then it just fades. Or your little brother's kicking the back of your seat while you're driving. You're like, man, eventually that just fades. What keeps it going is us continuing and going, I don't like that, right? I don't want that to be here. And that's engaging in sort of operating from fantasy world as opposed to just being anchored in the present moment. And so I guess the three guidelines, the first is you have to have a clear anchor, right? Some place to put your attention and then bring your attention back. Two is that we want a clear start and a clear end. And then paired with that, maybe 2A is that we want to start where we're successful. So don't put too much weight on the bar, right? So if it's going to be 2 minutes, start with 2 minutes. If 2 minutes feels doable, right, then you can up it to 3, right? But don't jump to 20 and then go, man, everything is awful and I hate it and I'm never doing it again, right? Because we've already outlined why this is such a powerful task that you can do, a powerful exercise.
Something that I thought about when you were talking about the mental reps and starting where you're going to keep doing it and not get frustrated and stop. Something that I think might benefit listeners to understand and think about this as is everybody understands and agrees with the sentiment of getting 1% better. And if people can reframe their meditation practice as, hey, that sucked. It was really frustrating because I felt like I was totally unfocused, but I did it. That's you doing the things to get 1% better. And as soon as you get into a practice that you're going to stop doing it because it's that difficult, you're not getting 1% better at this skill anymore. You're not getting better at all. And you might be losing the gains that you were making after meditating consistently. And the last guideline I'd like to include on this meditation practice is that consistency piece. So just like going to the gym, you cannot go to the gym a couple times a week here and there whenever you feel like it and expect to see significant results. You have to do this on a consistent basis every day. And this is where you're going to see the difference in your mental game, that you're going to see that improvement to your awareness of performance damaging thoughts and that improvement of refocusing on performance relevant cues.
And
So yeah, go
can
ahead.
I tag something there real quick? And so just like the gym example, right? If you haven't been in the gym for a while, you might go 3 days a week for a couple of weeks and then go 4 days a week. And then even then you still need rest days if you've been at it for 6 months or 6 years. Right. But it's a great point that there has to be some structure. Right. So I have to have been doing it intentionally. You can't just show up and go like, I'm gonna do a little bit of that and a little bit of this. You're not going to get stronger on purpose. Right. But that the consistency really is important. It's better to do 2 minutes 5 times a week than it is to do 20 minutes once.
Exactly. So lastly here, let's say there's a coach listening and they understand the benefits of meditation for their athletes and themselves to improve performance. How can a coach, what are maybe some examples that a coach can implement meditation practice within their team, either in practice and or in games?
It's a great question. And I think that, it speaks to maybe not a guideline, but an addendum to sort of what we're describing in terms of action items, but it's about setting the environment for success. And we don't really have control over our performance environments usually. And so we want to work backwards. And so whether you're a coach or an athlete, you think about the practice environment. Well, if I really want to help an athlete engage in that type of single tasking, right, then I'm going to try and design an environment or design drills or create small area games that are going to allow the athletes to focus on purpose on the task at hand, right, and not have a whole lot of added extra distraction. And recognize that when I'm learning a new task, right? Or a new system or some new structure, that it's going to be harder for me to be present because I'm going to do the thing and then pause and go, did I do it right? And then pause and do, and so that those actually fit better probably for like drills that have a little bit more stoppage to them, right? Or similarly, if you're, I keep coming back to golf because it's just about golf season, right? But like that idea that you can create pauses while you practice to bring yourself back to the present moment. And so I think there's something really powerful about setting the conditions, the physical environment conditions, as well as the internal conditions. And this goes for, right, if you're going to do the mindfulness practice away from the sport as well, right? Like early on, you don't want to be doing it in a crowded locker room. You might want to step away, create a quiet environment so that you can really allow your nervous system to down regulate, right? To downshift so that you can be a little bit more present. And so I think that that would be something that I want to talk to a coach a lot about first. And then one of the beautiful questions they can ask is, hey, where is your attention? Right. So through that last shift, where was your attention? Or when you notice, and coaches are great about picking up on some of the body language for their athletes, right? Is that you could even build in a cue, like an interrupter that the coach could say that allows them to say it. And it's like, all right, we've trained this so that now an athlete recognizes that they were kind of getting a little bit too internal and things were getting tight, and you could watch the shoulders creep up and they're probably ruminating about something. And oh, okay, coach noticed, and they're able to cut through the momentum of that train of thought. And now that becomes my noticing, and now I can come back to the present moment and then refocus on the task at hand.
Love it. The last way I'd like to suggest coaches to implement a structured meditation practice is during like a warm-up routine, or if the team's stretching. So during a team stretch, this is such a great opportunity to remind their athletes to try. Maybe they just carve out a minute and say, hey, for this stretch, we're going to hold it for 30, 60 seconds. Try and feel the sensation of your muscle being stretched and feeling like you're taking this weight off of your body and making it feel better. So that's a really, I think, easy opportunity to implement this practice, as well as it doesn't take any extra time out of your practice or this warm-up routine to implement this. It's just combining this physical element of stretching and then this mental game training of meditating.
Yeah, if your body is going to be here, there's a lot of value to getting your mind here too, as we think about starting to funnel into the performance itself. And I think one more point here is like, for coaches, oftentimes they get caught up, and they don't think, but they get caught up in this one size fits all. And so offering their athletes an opportunity to be present, right? So if you're stretching, it might not be all at the same point, right? But to invite your athletes to pick a point during the stretch where they feel like they can come to the present moment, or empower them pre-game that some of them are going to want more stimulation, some of them are going to want less, some of them are going to connect with people around them, some of them are going to just want their own space, but that they can include their mind being where their body is, regardless of what the task at hand is and whatever the environment is. And so I think that's an empowering thing to offer your athletes as well.
Absolutely. Well, Pete, I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking shop with me. This has been awesome. And I think a lot of listeners are going to be happy to hear how meditating can connect to being a better athlete, as well as hearing all these concrete ways to implement mindfulness-based meditation into their practice and games. So again, thank you. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to share where people can find you and the podcast again that you host, which is, again, excellent. If you're listening to this podcast, highly recommended.
Yeah, first, just thank you for the opportunity, Gabe. Really enjoy these types of conversations, and so grateful that you thought of me and asked me to come on. Appreciate the shout out as well for the Mental Training Lab, which you can find wherever podcasts are found these days. And then I'm not great at social media, but if you want to find me on Instagram, which is where a lot of the podcast updates show up, it's all day Dr. K, all day Dr. period K, all one word. Minus the period, right? The period kind of breaks up the word, but you get the idea. And I guess the thing that I'd want to throw out just to put a cherry on top of our meditation Sunday that we've been making here is that it's easy to get attached. And we've been talking a lot about attachment, right? It's easy to get attached to an idea of what you're going to get for meditation. And so, we've talked a lot of the benefits. But I'd push the listeners to expand their aperture and unhook from these expectations a little bit, because what I found, especially early on when I started practicing consistently, is that I got surprised that my presence and my non-judgment arrived at moments that I really wasn't expecting in ways that I wasn't expecting. And so although it's bled into my life in a way that now I find that I'm much more present, I notice thoughts for thoughts. I don't get caught up and then run down trains of thought or feeling in the same way I used to. And it allows me to perform better. That if I was super rigid about how I was thinking about what I was going to get, that it might be really easy to miss the benefits. And then if I'm missing the benefits, then I haven't closed the feedback loop, and that feedback loop feeds more dopamine, which motivates me, which means I want to do it more. And so be curious about how it's going to impact your life, and don't get too impatient of, well, I'm not performing better tomorrow, right? Because if we can do this consistently over time, it's going to help you perform better.
Yeah, needless to say, it's tough to pack in everything we need to talk about meditation into an hour, but I think we did a good job despite it.
Yeah, I mean, we could keep going, but you're right. There's a point where you start to diminish the returns.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you again, Pete, and we'll talk soon. Okay.
Sounds great. Thanks, Gabe.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you took something valuable away from this episode. Stay in the loop by following the Sports Psychology of on your go-to podcast platform, and find clips of each episode's best segments on YouTube, as well as Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. Do you want to take your mental game to the next level? Try out one-on-one sports psychology coaching with me, Gabe Zellico, by visiting my website, zellicoperformance.com. You can book a free intro call where we'll discuss your goals, obstacles to success, and determine if we'd be a good fit to move forward. You can also email me directly at thesportspsychology@gmail.com regarding one-on-one coaching or the podcast. Links to social media, my website, and email are all in the description. Thank you again for listening.